everyone, welcome to the show. Imagine facing a sky just completely filled with enemy fighters, and just knowing that your skill and the strength of your aircraft are all that stand between your comrades and just complete disaster.
It's quite a thought, isn't it?
It really is. And this was the reality faced by the pilots of Fighting Squadron 18 in World War II. So today we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating piece of naval aviation history.
Yeah.
We're exploring the experiences detailed in the book Intrepid's Fighting Squadron 18, Flying High with Harris's Hellcats.
Great book.
Oh, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah. Really well researched.
If you're, drawn to stories of courage and skill and just that human side of history, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives like this.
I think anyone who enjoys a good World War II story will appreciate this one.
Absolutely. So the book itself, it's a meticulously researched account by Michael Fink.
Yeah, he did a great job pulling together first-hand accounts and family histories.
Right. You'll find a link to it on Amazon down in the description.
Yeah, be sure to check it out.
And it's not just about the battles and the aircraft. It's really about the men,
Yeah, the human element is so important.
It really is. It explores the camaraderie, the loss, the intense pressure of aerial combat.
Right. And it's not just like a dry recounting of facts.
Yeah.
It really pulls you into their world.
Exactly. You really get a sense of what they were going through.
Their hopes, their fears, the whole thing.
And I think that's what makes this book so compelling.
I agree.
So today we're diving into the early deployments and the initial combat experiences of Fighting Squadron 18 aboard the USS Intrepid.
Yeah, that first taste of combat is always so pivotal.
Absolutely. We'll explore, what it was like transitioning from training to the brutal reality of war.
Right, going from the classroom to the cockpit.
Exactly. Encountering the enemy for the first time and, how their skills and tactics developed under fire.
That learning curve is so steep.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's start with the men themselves. Who were these young pilots who found themselves on the front lines of the Pacific War?
Well, what strikes me is just how diverse their backgrounds were.
Right.
You had guys like Cecil Harris. He was a teacher before the war.
Yeah, a school teacher turned fighter pilot. That's quite a transition.
It is. Then you have Punchy Mallory. He was a student at West Virginia University.
Interesting.
And then Ed Ritter. He was pretty upfront about his reasons for wanting to be a fighter pilot.
Oh, yeah. What was his motivation?
He said he wanted to avoid the responsibility of having a larger crew.
Oh, so he preferred to be on his own up there?
Yeah, just him and his aircraft.
That's interesting. I guess it takes a certain personality type to thrive in that kind of environment.
Definitely. And then you had Buck Newsome. He came from the Citadel, so, military service was kind of in his blood.
Right, strong tradition there.
Absolutely. And then Bill Ziemer, he had actually earned a football scholarship.
Wow, so a real mix of backgrounds and experiences.
Yeah, it really shows how the war touched so many different lives.
It's amazing to see how their paths converged, from these completely different starting points. They all ended up in the same squadron facing the same dangers.
Yeah, a real band of brothers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's talk about their training.
Yeah.
How did these men prepare for the incredible challenges that lay ahead?
Well, the training was incredibly rigorous.
Yeah, I bet.
They started with basic flight training, learning the fundamentals in aircraft, like the N-3N biplane.
Oh, the yellow peril.
Yeah, that's the one. It was a challenging aircraft to master.
And then they moved on to more advanced training, right?
Exactly. They flew the Vultee SNV Valiant. They nicknamed it the Vibrator.
The Vibrator. I can only imagine why.
Yeah, it was known for being a bit rough.
And that was all before they even got to carrier qualification.
Yeah, which was a whole other challenge altogether.
Landing on a moving ship in the middle of the ocean, I can't even imagine.
It takes nerves of steel and incredible skill.
It really does.
And what's interesting is that even with all that training, even with the best instructors and the most realistic simulations, nothing could truly prepare them for the realities of combat.
Right. That's the thing about war, isn't it? There's no substitute for experience.
Absolutely. And unfortunately for these pilots, that experience came at a high cost.
It always does. So let's talk about their first deployment, their first taste of action. Where did that take them?
Well, their first deployment was to the Palau Islands in September of 1944.
Okay. And what was the objective there?
The objective was to support the landings on Palau and to conduct strikes against Japanese positions in the Philippines.
So they were going right into the heart of the action.
They were, and, they were all eager to prove themselves. They'd been training for this moment for so long.
Right. I bet they were ready to get out there and do what they'd been trained to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the Palau strikes themselves turned out to be relatively uneventful.
Really?
Yeah, they didn't encounter much enemy resistance at all. Just A little bit of anti-aircraft fire here and there.
So a bit of an anticlimax?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, they were all keyed up, ready for a fight, and it just didn't materialize.
But that was just the calm before the storm, right?
Exactly. Their first real taste of combat came a few days later during the strikes against Luzon.
Okay, and that was a significant escalation, wasn't it?
Luzon was a major strategic target for the Allies, and the Japanese were determined to defend it.
So they were facing much heavier resistance this time.
They were, and they suffered their first combat losses.
That must have been a devastating blow.
It was, but it also steeled their resolve. They knew what they were up against now, and they were determined to fight back.
So tell me about some of those early engagements. What were those first dogfights like?
Well, they were chaotic, intense, just a whirlwind of action.
I bet it was hard to even keep track of what was going on.
Yeah, especially in those early days, they were still learning the ropes, figuring out what worked and what didn't.
But they were also scoring victories, right?
Yeah, Cecil Harris became the squadron's first ace during those early engagements.
Wow, an ace in their first real combat. That's incredible.
It is. It shows just how skilled and how determined he was.
And he wasn't the only one.
Right. No, there were many other pilots who distinguished themselves in those early battles.
So as the fighting intensified, did their tactics evolve?
They learned from every engagement. They constantly adapted and refined their techniques.
What were some of those key adaptations?
Well, one of the biggest changes was the increasing reliance on teamwork.
Okay, how so?
They realized that they couldn't just go it alone. They had to work together to survive.
Right, their strength in numbers.
Exactly. They started flying in tighter formations. They covered each other's backs. They developed new strategies for attacking and defending.
So they were really becoming a cohesive fighting unit.
They were learning to fight as a team, and that made all the difference.
And that teamwork wasn't just limited to the air, right?
No, it extended to their interactions with the rest of the ship's crew, the mechanics, the armorers, the flight deck personnel. Everyone played a vital role in their success.
Right. It was a truly collaborative effort.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things I find so fascinating about naval aviation. It's not just about the pilots, it's about the entire team working together to achieve a common goal.
I agree. It's a truly remarkable operation.
So as they gain more experience, did they encounter any particular challenges?
One of the biggest challenges they faced was the ever-present threat of friendly fire.
Oh, wow. That must have been terrifying.
It was in the heat of battle. It could be difficult to distinguish friend from foe.
Right, especially with so many aircraft in the air.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there were a number of incidents where American pilots were mistakenly shot down by their own side.
That's just tragic.
It is, and it highlights the importance of clear communication and effective identification procedures.
Absolutely. So how did they address that challenge?
They implemented a number of measures. They improved their radio communications. They developed new visual signals. They worked closely with the radar operators to improve their tracking and identification capabilities.
So it was a constant process of learning and adapting.
They were always striving to improve their safety and effectiveness.
And it wasn't just about avoiding friendly fire, right? They also had to contend with increasingly sophisticated enemy defenses.
Right. The Japanese were constantly improving their tactics and their technology.
So it was a real back and forth, each side trying to outmaneuver and outgun the other.
It was, and the stakes were incredibly high.
Every mission carried the risk of death or capture.
And yet these pilots continued to fly day after day, mission after mission.
It's hard to fathom that kind of courage, facing those kinds of odds day in and day out.
It really is. They were an extraordinary group of men.
They were, and their stories deserve to be remembered.
Absolutely.
So let's shift our focus a bit to the aircraft themselves. They were flying the F-6F Hellcat, which was considered one of the best fighters of the war. What made it so effective?
Well, the Hellcat was a really well-designed aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
It was fast, it was maneuverable, it was heavily armed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and how did it compare to the Japanese fighters they were up against?
It was generally superior to most of the Japanese aircraft they encountered.
So that must have given them a significant advantage.
It did. It allowed them to dictate the terms of the engagement.
And did they have any particular tactics that they used to exploit the Hellcat's strengths?
They did. They often used a tactic called high-side attack.
Okay, what's that?
Well, basically, they would use their superior altitude and speed to dive down on the enemy aircraft from above.
Oh, I see. So they could take advantage of gravity and surprise.
Exactly. It was a very effective tactic.
And did the Hellcat have any weaknesses?
Well, no aircraft is perfect. And the Hellcat did have a few limitations.
Such as?
Well, its rate of climb wasn't as good as some of the Japanese fighters.
Oh, so it could be vulnerable if it was caught at a lower altitude.
Yeah, and it was also a bit heavier than some of the more agile Japanese aircraft.
So it wasn't as nimble in a tight turning fight.
Right. But overall, it was a very formidable aircraft.
It sounds like it, and it played a crucial role in the Allied victory in the Pacific.
It absolutely did. It was a real game changer.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways? You know, what do you think is most important for our listeners to remember about the experiences of Fighting Squadron 18?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is just how young these pilots were.
Right, they were barely out of their teens in many cases.
Exactly. They were thrust into a incredibly demanding and dangerous situation, and they rose to the occasion.
It's amazing to think about the courage and resilience they displayed.
It really is. They were facing death on a daily basis, and yet they never wavered.
And they weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting for the freedom of others.
Right. They were part of a much larger struggle, a fight for democracy against tyranny.
And I think it's important to remember that their sacrifices were not in vain.
Absolutely. Their efforts helped to secure the victory that we all enjoy today.
And their stories continue to inspire us.
They do. They remind us of the importance of courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for what's right.
Well said. So thank you for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You know what resonated with you the most about the story of Fighting Squadron 18? Share your insights in the comments below.
Yeah, we're always eager to hear from our audience.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned.
Until next time.
Take care, everyone.